In the early 90s, arcade gaming was all about fast action and high scores, and Super Smash TV delivered both in brutal fashion. Released for the Sega Mega Drive, this twin-stick shooter brought the chaos of the arcade hit to home consoles, packing in non-stop gunfire, relentless waves of enemies, and a dystopian game show where the only prize is survival. But how well did this run-and-gun classic hold up in the transition from arcade to console? Let's take a deep dive into Super Smash TV for the Sega Mega Drive. Bringing an arcade game as fast-paced and chaotic as Super Smash TV to the Sega Mega Drive was no easy task. The original arcade version ran on powerful Williams hardware, with dual joystick controls, high-quality sound, and a screen packed with enemies. But the Mega Drive had its limits. So, how did the developers at Probe Software make it work? Let's break it down. Adapting the twin-stick controls. One of the biggest challenges was translating the arcade's dual joystick controls onto a standard Mega Drive controller. In the arcade, you moved with one stick and fired in any direction with the other, perfect for a game like this. But on a standard 3-button controller? That wasn't happening. Instead, movement was handled with the D-pad, while the A, B, and C buttons fired in different directions. If you had a 6-button controller, things were a little better. You could fire in all directions using the extra buttons, giving a closer feel to the original arcade gameplay. It wasn't perfect, but it was one of the better compromises for a home console at the time. Graphics and performance trade-offs. The arcade version of Super Smash TV had detailed sprites, smooth animations, and a ton of enemies on screen at once. The Mega Drive? Not so much. With a limited 64-color palette on screen and less memory to work with, the developers had to make some cuts. Sprite detail was reduced, and some animations were simplified. Backgrounds were made less complex to keep performance stable. And because the Mega Drive could only handle so many sprites on screen at once, some enemies would flicker in and out when the action got intense. Even with these limitations, they still managed to keep the game fast and smooth, for the most part. Sound and music compression. If you've played the arcade version, you'll remember the big, booming announcer voice and intense soundtrack. But the Mega Drive's YM2612 sound chip wasn't exactly built for high-quality digitized sound. To fit everything into a cartridge, voice clips like Big Money, Big Prizes, were heavily compressed and sounded much rougher than in the arcade. The music was recreated using FM synthesis, but some tracks lost the depth and clarity of the original. And in intense moments, sound effects would sometimes cut each other off, like explosions drowning out gunfire. Enemy AI and on-screen limits. The arcade version could throw huge waves of enemies at the player without breaking a sweat. But on the Mega Drive, processing power and memory were more limited. The developers had to reduce the number of enemies on screen at times to prevent slowdown. Enemy AI was slightly simplified, some patterns weren't as aggressive as in the arcade version. But even with these changes, the game still managed to feel just as relentless as the original, keeping the arcade experience intact. Despite all these technical hurdles, Super Smash TV on the Mega Drive stayed surprisingly true to the arcade version. The fast action, the over-the-top game show setting, and the bullet hell chaos were all there. Sure, it had its compromises, but for a 16-bit home console, it was an impressive adaptation. With the SNES version of Super Smash TV, you might know that it was brutally difficult, with relentless enemy spawns that could feel almost unfair. The Mega Drive version, while still challenging, actually had slightly more balanced enemy waves. Enemies didn't respawn quite as aggressively, making it a little easier to strategize your movements, though don't get me wrong, it was still a tough game. Faster load times and seamless action. Unlike some other home versions, the Mega Drive port kept the action flowing smoothly. No noticeable load times, no awkward screen transitions between rooms, just fast, relentless gameplay, staying true to the arcade experience. One of the best co-op experiences on the Mega Drive. For those lucky enough to play this game in co-op mode, Super Smash TV was one of the most intense multiplayer experiences on the system. 2 players, a screen full of enemies, bullets flying everywhere. It was chaos in the best possible way. While the control scheme wasn't perfect, the co-op mode remained one of the best ways to enjoy the game. So, while this version of Super Smash TV had its compromises, it also had some great features that made it stand out. If you had a 6-button controller and a friend to play with, this was one of the best ways to experience the game outside of the arcade. Now, as fun and chaotic as Super Smash TV was, the Sega Mega Drive version wasn't without its problems. From technical hiccups to gameplay quirks, let's take a look at some of the most notable issues that players encountered. Sprite flickering and slowdown. If you played a lot of fast-paced games on the Mega Drive, you'll know that sprite flickering and slowdown can be a real issue, and Super Smash TV was no exception. When too many enemies, bullets, and explosions were on screen, the game would struggle to keep up. The frame rate would dip, and sprites would flicker in and out of existence, making it tough to tell what was happening in the heat of battle. Enemy AI glitches. The game was already tough, but sometimes, the enemy AI had a mind of its own. In some rooms, enemies could get stuck in corners or even off-screen, making them easy to pick off, or in rare cases, impossible to reach, forcing a reset. There were also moments where enemies failed to spawn properly, leaving players stuck in an empty arena with no way to progress. Not exactly what you want when you're deep into a run. Sound and music issues. Now, the Mega Drive sound chip had its limitations, and Super Smash TV definitely pushed it. The voice samples, like the famous Big Money, Big Prizes, were heavily compressed and sometimes cut off mid-sentence. In some cases, the music would glitch out entirely, either playing the wrong track or stopping altogether, leaving you blasting through waves of enemies in awkward silence. Multiplayer sync issues. If you played this game in co-op, you might have noticed some odd moments where the game just didn't seem to keep up. Sometimes, player positions would desync slightly, leading to weird hit detection problems. And if there were too many enemies on screen, the second player's controls could feel delayed, making dodging incoming fire even harder. Level transition bug. And then there's one of the most frustrating issues, getting stuck between levels. In rare cases, after clearing a room, the game just wouldn't trigger the exit. No enemies left, no doors opening, nothing. If this happened, your only choice was to reset and start over, definitely not ideal in a game this challenging. So, how did Super Smash TV perform in terms of sales? Well, like many arcade ports of the early 90s, it didn't exactly set the charts on fire, but it still found a dedicated audience. Sales and reception. The game was released on multiple platforms, including the Sega Mega Drive, SNES, Amiga, and even DOS. While exact sales numbers for the Mega Drive version are hard to pin down, it wasn't a massive hit, but it did well enough to be remembered as one of the more faithful home versions of the arcade original. At the end of the day, Super Smash TV on the Sega Mega Drive was a solid, if slightly compromised, port of an arcade classic. It brought the fast-paced, bullet-hell chaos of the original into living rooms, and while it had its technical limitations, it still delivered on that game show-inspired, over-the-top action. But what do you think? Did Super Smash TV on the Mega Drive live up to the arcade version? Or was there another home port that did it better? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this retrospective, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into retro gaming. Thanks for watching, and as always, good luck. You'll need it.